Hey podcaster, I'm Tim Wahlberg, your podcast performance coach, with another actionable tip so you can sound like a pro and gain more podcast fans. Today's tip is know the bare minimum. I had a conversation with a colleague the other day. He loves podcasts and listens to a ton of them. He was telling me about one of his faves. It follows his favorite sports team. So he's all in. He told me about this host who gets really great guests like former players and coaches, all of his heroes, right? It's like this host had inside access and delivers amazing content that no one else can do. Then he said, it's awesome, but I don't listen to it anymore. I said, why? He said, because the audio sucks. He said, I couldn't hear any of it. He said, the levels are brutal, the host sounds bad, the guests sound worse, and it really became annoying, so I stopped listening to it. Can you imagine this happening to you? Can you imagine someone saying to you, hey, I love the content of your show, but I can't stand listening to it? Don't be the best podcast your listener won't listen to. If you think the audio quality of your podcast doesn't matter just because your content is good, you're wrong. People will not put up with it. There is a bare minimum you need to reach. And if you're not hitting it, you shouldn't be publishing that episode. Or you shouldn't have a podcast at all. In this episode, I'm going to tell you what the bare minimum is. By the way, this is the low bar, so please strive for higher, okay? So, what's not acceptable? Let's start with that. Inconsistent levels. This is the most noticeable and the most annoying for your listener. You, the host, is really loud, and your guest is at this volume, so they're struggling to hear them. All of a sudden, your host jumps in, and they're all over them. And then your guest is continuing in the background. And too late, because you've blown your listeners' brains out. And they're scrambling to reach their phone to get control, and they're yanking their earbuds out of their ears and cursing the hell out of you at that second. That's not fun for anybody. There's also crackling static or digital ticking the whole way through. There's big echoes, and it sounds like your guest is recording using a tin can as a microphone. There's distracting backgrounds like street noise or crowds, restaurant dishes, and other sounds. This sounds extreme, but people are doing this. You might be doing this. Don't let me catch you doing this. Frankly, anything that causes your listener to be thinking about your audio quality rather than the amazing content oozing from your lips is not good enough. And P.S., you're blowing it. Just make your podcast listenable. That's the bare minimum. At least meet the one and only expectation anyone listening to any podcast on the planet has for a podcast. They just want to hear it. So, how do you execute decent audio quality? First, you need to sound good. You need a decent mic. Doesn't have to cost $500 either. You, the host, should always sound better than your guest. This is you creating your recording space so it consistently sounds crisp, clear, rich, and full. You need a soft room, and you need to be close to your microphone. Listen to episode number 42, How to Get the Most of Your Mic, and episode 1, Mic Placement, for more on this. A lot of podcasters are pretty good up to this point, but when they bring in a guest is when they sometimes fall down. When you connect with your guest and they sound crappy through your headphones because you're wearing headphones, episode 9, great news! Now your podcast sounds crappy. So spend a couple of minutes before your recording session with a guest and make sure that they sound good. Guide them a little if you have to. Your guests don't have to be in a studio or have perfect audio, but don't be afraid to demand this bare minimum from them. Tell them to lean into their microphone. Tell them to find a quieter room. Tell them to close the window. And don't be afraid to say these things to a high-profile guest. If they're a big deal, they'll get it and most likely accommodate you. If you're doing interviews on location and they're sounding like crap, it's either your equipment, how you're using it, or your environment. Use the best equipment you have access to. Know how to properly use it and make the most out of your location by finding the quietest and acoustically friendly space you can. Keep this in mind. The more people you add and the bigger your room is, the more issues you're going to have. After all this, and after you've done some basic editing to remove those distracting sounds, don't forget to add a little EQ to your audio and some compression to equal out your levels. If you want more technical tips on sounding great and having your guests sound great, go to podcastperformancecoach.com/podcasts and click on technical. Those are all of my episodes that deal with technical tips. One more thing. Listen to your podcast before you publish it. Remember, your podcast audio quality matters, so make it a priority. Your podcast has to be listenable. This is the bare minimum. Strive for higher, but at least hit the bare minimum, or you're going to lose listeners. And I hope that's just the tip you need. A lot of these issues can be avoided if you've got a solid podcast recording routine. Good habits start with a checklist. Get my free 25-point checklist and post it where you record your show. It will get you 25 steps closer to sounding more like a pro. Just go to podcastperformancecoach.com, click on episode 67, and click the download link for my free checklist. I'm Tim Walberg. See you.